So we're here this afternoon to hear about new models in financial aid. As you heard, I'm Eric Zarnikow from the Illinois Student Assistance Commission, and at ISAC, our acronym, we deliver about $380 million of primarily need-based financial aid to help students in Illinois go to college. So we're constantly looking at ways to make our programs more effective. So I really look forward to hearing from our panelists this afternoon. Very brief background. In 2003, the Lumina Foundation asked a number of authors to explore state policies for affordability through their new model of student financial support white paper series. And there were 15 expert papers that resulted from that were released in April of this year. And we're privileged to have 4 of those authors on our panel here today. I had the fortune of hearing from several of our panelists at earlier sessions, and they really did a great job, so I look forward to hearing them at this session. I did have a chance to read each of the 4 papers, and having a background that's primarily a private sector finance person and still very new to higher education, I was concerned as I began to read the papers whether or not there'd be a lot of big words and higher education acronyms that I wouldn't understand. But while they were all very scholarly, I did find that I could also understand them. So I think that's a key thing to a good research paper, that it goes to the audience, but also the lay people can understand. I'm going to introduce each of our panelists who will present on their paper, and then we have some questions that I'm going to ask of the panelists, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. So each of the panelists has their full bio in the conference book, so I'm not going to read the bio to you, but I'm going to introduce them in the order that they're going to talk. Brian Prescott is the Director of Policy Research at Wiki, where he co-manages the Policy and Analysis and Research Unit with primary responsibility for obtaining and analyzing education and workforce data with public policy relevance. I did note that in his bio that among a number of degrees that he has, that he's a graduate of University of Iowa. Now, growing up in Iowa and being a graduate of Iowa State University, there is a little bit of rivalry in Iowa about which is the better school academically and athletically, but we'll take that discussion offline later. Katie Zaback is part of the team at SHEEO, where she joined in 2010 as a policy analyst. She supports SHEEO's efforts to improve state policymakers' access to quality information that will help inform their education policy decisions. Katie is also a recent mother and is actually joining us from maternity leave. And I only know that because at the end of the Ignite SHEEO session last night, she was carrying around what arguably may be the world's cutest baby. Also, we have David Wright, who is the Chief Policy Officer for the Tennessee Higher Education Commission, where he engages system heads, campus leaders, and the legislative and executive branches on a range of higher education policy issues. And Tennessee has made some significant changes in their funding of higher education system that David's going to be talking about. And Lashawn Richburg-Hayes is the director of MDRC's Young Adults and Post-Secondary Education Policy Area, which is principally focused on finding ways to increase academic achievement and persistence among low-income college students. Now, looking for an acronym on what MDRC means, I went to their website and actually couldn't find what it actually means, and I've discovered now that it's just MDRC. I did note that MDRC does a lot of real-world testing of policy theories, and I'm really looking to hear more about some of their findings. So I'm going to turn it over at this point to Brian.
Great. Thanks and good afternoon, everyone. I guess go Hawks would be what my response to that would be. Okay. So let's see if I can operate this thing. Okay. So this is the cover. I knew you all wanted to see this really desperately. This is the cover of our report. We spent a lot of time on the graphics. But anyway, so we called it States in the Driver's Seat, and I hope you'll see why by the end of my comments. But those of you who have been studying, or been around higher education or studied or went to a graduate program in particular, you'd recognize the title of this slide as the title of a report by the Carnegie Commission in 1973, which suggests that we've been talking about this topic of affordability and what are the appropriate balance of payments for an awfully long time. But just to simply state that I think that the policy drift, which is how I would describe it, that that we've been living through in terms of financing higher education means that we haven't decided what the right balance of payments are, in spite of that good advice we received 40 years ago. And as a result, we have no real consensus on what affordability means. I think I'm, out of a moment of panic, called it's like pornography at a meeting before. Everybody knows what it is when they see it, but that's the only time. And but we have an agreement that it's eroded, but that's about it. And so in our paper, we sort of took the approach that we were going to be really pretty ambitious in as few pages as possible. And that was to suggest a framework for finding what would an appropriate balance of payment sources be, to give some reasoning behind a greater coherence for state finance policies, appropriations, and tuition setting authority in particular, to integrate sources of subsidies, to align incentives with the state goals, which would not always be the same as the institutional goals or even the students' goals, and to include a possible means for restraining prices through a federal-state partnership. I think, as you see, you'll note that as I sat listening this morning to the Undersecretary, I was getting increasingly excited because virtually everything that he touched upon as it relates to this, and I think perhaps I have George to thank for prompting in this direction, we've addressed in some way, maybe not adequately, but in some way in this paper. So at this point, I would argue that this attention to affordability has acquired its own momentum, in a sense, new momentum in the wake of the recession, or perhaps because of the recession, but almost all the attention has been on federal policies. And with 3/4 of the undergraduates being educated in public institutions, we should recognize that that federal aid policy has a uniform impact across all, at least state contexts. And so in many respects, it's the state context through which the federal policies are filtered that really determine affordability for the vast majority of students who are being enrolled in higher education. So with that, what we're suggesting is that Witchy had a project about a decade ago that was funded by the Lumina Foundation called Changing Direction, the goal of which, in broad strokes, was to try to get states that were involved to create better coherence and alignment between their three principal levers of state finance: appropriations, tuition, and financial aid, hence this acronym ATFA. And our paper argues that in some respects, if you think about financial aid as being at the core of it would help make this coherence go. But the situation we face now is we have this trade-off that often occurs between appropriations and tuition setting. Those are the headline seeking, or the headline attracting finance policies. And then financial aid is sort of what happens next with whatever's left. And we often are creating financial aid policies to meet whatever the budget is for those financial aid policies, not what would help students most effectively or the state meet its educational attainment goals. And so what we are suggesting is that we convert into I was a little limited. As you saw from the cover, these are the best graphics we've got. So we've got a larger gear for financial aid, suggesting that that's the principal policy lever that needs to drive the other two. And how are we going to do that? Well, we've got, let me see if I can follow my notes here. To begin with, we would say, we make the argument that in order to do this, states need to start from the perspective of the cost of attendance, the full cost of attendance being the operating level of payments that we need to account for. And if we can do that, and we have some straightforward communication about cost of attendance, then doing so helps clarify the state commitment, and it helps to promote strategic rationing when inevitably the funds are insufficient to do all the things that we want to do. And I think we would also argue that it induces more strategic and alignment between finance policies and other sources of subsidy. And so we have this approach called shared responsibility. Shared responsibility is a term that's finding wide use in a lot of different settings. We might have to think about branding something new. But nonetheless, we have a term called shared responsibility that will describe how we're going to meet these full costs of attendance, at least as a framework for distributing financial aid. I should mention here that Minnesota and Oregon, and to some extent Idaho, also use this to distribute their financial aid, grant aid dollars. But basically, you begin with a statewide recognized cost of attendance that includes the full sector-based averages, tuition and fees, and then a frugal non-tuition expenses budget that perhaps pays for what the student would minimally need to live off of, but not the climbing walls and the lazy rivers and all those things that have attracted so much attention and really distracted so much attention to the real issues facing higher education. But we have this full block for recognized cost of attendance, and each party is going to contribute a share. Each student, the principal beneficiary of his or her own education, is going to be expected to contribute a substantial amount towards his or her own full costs. And in the states where this works, this is a substantial amount. In Oregon, it's tied to what a student can earn in minimum wage over 48 weeks per year, 15 hours per week for the full year, and then a borrowing expectation for those students attending public four-year institutions as well. So it's pretty hefty, and it's equivalent across the entire income spectrum. Then the student's parents, if they're a dependent student, or his or her spouse, if they're independent, has an expectation as well that comes out of the federal methodology, however flawed we may believe that to be. And then the third component is the federal government's contribution, principally through Pell Grants, but in Oregon it also takes into account what the student would be eligible for in tuition tax credits. And then finally, under full implementation and in a just and ideal world, the state government's grant amount would account for the entire rest of the pie. However, since we're using sector-based tuition averages, we recognize that some institutions charge more than the average, and so there's an expectation embedded within this that institutions that charge more than that recognized cost amount would find a way to fund those institutions to that full amount of their cost, the actual cost of attendance. I'll mention in a moment there's other ways in which we're thinking about the institution's expectation as well. But additionally, an institutional grant and private scholarships we often consider to be the part of the student's contribution. If it's something that he or she has earned, then it goes towards offsetting that relatively substantial expectation from them. I think one of the things that we did with the paper, beyond kind of describing and tweaking a little bit the approaches taken in Minnesota and Oregon, is to think about ways in which we can talk about incentives, however. And so let me begin by saying around financial aid, most of the research, most of the attention around policy formulation and refinement relates to it's a demand. We think of it solely as a demand-side intervention. So to begin with, it's a demand-side intervention. We're going to provide funds to students who would otherwise not be able to afford college. We'll provide them with funds that will be able to allow them to do something that other than they would otherwise do. And so in our paper, we also have demand-side interventions that go beyond that. We talk about the Aid Like a Paycheck approach that Lashawn will probably describe. We talk about 15 credits as being full-time and the like. But one area we don't think about intentionally, I've started to realize, is the supply side effects of financial aid. Sure, we talk about, we have a grant program, how is the institution going to respond? But what I'm suggesting is we think about ways in which we intentionally embed supply-side incentives into our financial aid and into our grant program to align the incentives for the students and the institutions together to serve those students. In effect, if we think of it as a wager, the state is making a bet on the student who they're funding for higher education. We would expect that we want the institution to double down on that bet and make sure that they're at some risk and there's a risk reward in play for the institution to either lose money if that student is not successful or to gain money if that student is. That's one portion of the supply-side intervention I'll describe in more detail if I'm questioned about it. But the second one is also aligning investments. And here I'll mention that College Board suggests there's $44.5 billion of institutional grant aid out there. A lot of it's in private institution, I'll grant you. but we don't know very much about how that money is actually distributed, the actual policies. And what I'm suggesting is that we figure out ways in which we account for the real wealth that is occurring among some institutions. Not all, certainly not even the majority, but many of the wealthy institutions are spending money in ways we don't know much about, and that may be going much further up the income spectrum than we would ideally like to see. And so part of what we're suggesting is that state grant programs can expect that institutions might contribute some of their own funds towards those same exact individuals they're funding separately. And then I'm going to turn this over in just a second to Katie, because one of the real key points of alignment between Witchy's paper and SHEEO's relates to this notion of incentives for states. And this is where Undersecretary Mitchell was talking about federal-state partnership. Each of our papers included within it the beginnings of an idea about what a new federal-state partnership might look like. In our case, we're talking about trying to set states in competition with one another over affordability metrics for a pot of federal aid dollars. The idea there being that states that don't have well-designed and targeted financial aid programs would not be able to count on very much money from that pool without some strategic redesign, and that states that are doing well will see some of that additional money come their way to help their students find college to be much more affordable. And with that, I think I'm done, and I'd like to pass it on to my colleagues.
Thanks, Brian. So we started at SHEEO out with the problem, and I think it's a problem that all of us in this room have identified, given the conversation that we've had over the last week. And essentially, in order for us to reach those very lofty attainment goals that have been set forth for us to achieve, we are going to have to do a better job educating our low-income students and helping them succeed in our current system. So we think that there's a couple things that are going on in the current system that are getting in the way of this. The first is that a problem with misdirected resources. In the 1990s and early 2000s, you saw a significant increase in the number of aid programs that states use, or that states, the number of merit aid programs that are being administered by states. Yes? Okay. Oftentimes, what that results in is dollars going to students who would have otherwise enrolled in post-secondary education, and so we don't help improve our attainment goals necessarily. So we see this as a misdirection of resources, and I think you saw that in Suzanne Mettler's slides yesterday morning. Another problem that we see is that as resources has been redirected, and with the change from, or with the increasing reliance on tuition at the state level instead of state support that happened during the economic downturn, is you see a increasing cost of college, and that really impacts our low-income students. One of the impacts of that is that those students, instead of enrolling full-time, those students end up enrolling part-time because they have to work and they have to come up with a way to get those other resources so that they can enroll. And a lot of research has been done on what are the impacts of students not enrolling full-time. We did just a quick look at some National Student Clearinghouse data and found that there's a real strong correlation between full-time enrollment and completion. And there's been other research that's been done out there in the field. And then finally, we looked at the research, and it really shows that additional grant dollars can have an impact on the success of low-income students. And so this is what we wanted to focus our policy on. So for the white paper that we wrote, we had 3 focuses. The first thing that we wanted to focus on is we wanted to ensure that we take into account state context. So we recognize, as Joni Finney talked about yesterday, that states have different contexts and different things work within different states, and we wanted to take that into account when we developed the proposal that we put forth. The second thing is that we wanted to develop a framework and a methodology for directing need-based grant aid to low-income students through a federal-state partnership. So this is what Brian talked about, is how can we create a federal-state partnership that directs money to the students who need it most. And one of the things that we put into that state partnership is an affordability threshold, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And I think it's one of the things that distinguishes our policy from our proposal from other proposals out there. And then finally, we realized that major change couldn't happen, and we wanted to look at, or it won't happen immediately. So we wanted to look at what are some policies out there right now that states might be able to implement that could make a difference. And one of the things we thought was promising is an incentive for students to enroll at higher credit hour thresholds. We know a lot of states have embedded this into their financial aid programs and have been using it in other ways. So we did some case studies to examine what works in that area. So on the first point, I use this graphic just to illustrate that our states are different and distinct. They have different histories, different geographical challenges, and different fiscal cultures within their state. When it comes to higher education specifically, you can see this chart shows the differences in net tuition as a percent of public higher education total revenue within our states. It's from the SHEEO survey from 2013. But you'll see there's significant difference. The state that I grew up in, Wyoming, is on one end with 13% of their total educational revenue coming from tuition. And the state I currently live in, Colorado, is on the other end of the spectrum. Similarly, our need-based grant programs are need-based grant programs are different, or the dollar amounts available for need-based grants. And so this kind of illustrates that. So I'm going to talk now about the policy, the state-federal partnership that we put forward. And essentially, we wanted it to do a number of things. First, to the point of states being different and distinct, we wanted it to meet states where they are. We understand, like the Undersecretary said this morning, that states had to make some very hard decisions during the downturn, and that those things can't be turned around overnight. So it's important for us to meet states where they are today. The second thing we wanted to do is we wanted to tie this policy specifically towards the aid that goes to students, so specifically towards grant aid. The third thing that we wanted to do is we wanted to reward states that commit to making college more affordable, particularly for the lowest income students. We wanted to really make sure that that's who this money was going to. And then finally, we wanted to reward states that have that commitment to affordability by giving them some additional resources once they've met this affordability threshold. So on the next slide, I'm going to go ahead and explain the proposal that we put forward. And there's a lot more detail as well as the implications and cost implications in our paper, and still certainly room for development. So we propose with this state and federal partnership that the state puts in a certain amount of money and the federal government matches them for as part of a state need-based aid program. The goal of this program should be to serve students at less than 200% of poverty, and the goal of the program should be to reduce net price for those students. And what we'd like to see as a result of that is that you would see increased completion rates because these students have more resources and they are not having to deal with a financial burden, as high a financial burden. We recognize that some states already put a lot of money towards higher education and have lower tuition, and we want to reward those states. We don't want to do the same thing for all states. So we defined an affordability threshold, which we calculated using the income-based repayment threshold that is used by the federal government. And we use that as a calculation because it's already out there, and also it allows us to incorporate a state's median income, which again allows us to differentiate between the circumstances of different states. So once a state reaches that affordability threshold, once income or tuition in that state is at that affordability threshold, then a state gets a block grant that they do not have to pay back, or that they do not have to match, but that must be tied towards completion outcomes. So the state can do whatever they want with that as long as they can show that it's improving completion for their low-income students. So that's an overview of the policy that we've proposed. The final thing I want to talk about is the case studies that we did on policies that encourage students to enroll at higher credit thresholds. And this has been a policy that's been proposed or that's been encouraged by groups like HCM and by Complete College America. We wanted to know what really seems to work. And so what we did is we did a case study of 4 states that do this or that have this program in one way, shape, or form. West Virginia, which has a credit threshold as part of their merit program. Indiana, Minnesota, and Hawaii. And we had a number of findings, and I encourage you to read about them more in our paper. I'll just highlight a few. The first is it's important that you align these programs with existing state goals, that you are pragmatic and willing to compromise during the development and implementation of these programs. And we saw this as very important in states like Indiana that worked closely with their institutions to implement the program. It's important that you get buy-in from multiple stakeholders. Minnesota in particular did a great job of getting buy-in from their legislature to help protect the program that they have that does this. Making sure that you keep your program simple and transparent. Ensuring that you have complementary programs. So Hawaii has a 15 to finish program that's been extremely successful. Part of the reason is because they have banded tuition, which allows an incentive for students to enroll at 15 credit hours because they cost the same amount as 12 credit hours. We encourage you to monitor. States that are monitoring their programs can see big outcomes. We know that West Virginia did a good job monitoring what was going on. They also stacked their this policy with need-based aid. Finally, we think that it's really important that states act now. These are policies that can be implemented within lots of different governance structures and lots of different circumstances. So we encourage you to take a look, and I'll go ahead and pass it on to David.
Thank you, Katie. Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I'd like to congratulate you just for still being here. You're the few, the proud, the hangers-on. And secondly, I was going to remark to Katie that I saw in our slide at Tennessee what we do well is immunization, and I was shocked. I've never heard that. But then I remembered 2 years ago we had a meningitis outbreak on our campuses, and so maybe we did it well in response to something like that. I'm sort of going to pull back the curtain on a single state's thinking about the partnership idea that we're talking about. It's still in the draft on the drawing board stages, but our next master planning cycle, which is due July of 2015, our next long-range strategic plan, will flesh this and some other ideas out even more, and then try to seek support from our folks that are operative at the federal level to help us implement this. The backdrop is that Tennessee has been engaged in the education attainment work sort of all in since 2008 when we engaged our friends at Inchems to help us with a policy audit. Thank you, Patrick. And they showed us some areas in which we were misaligned between our goals of education attainment and our current state policies. And financial aid and how we financed our institutions were certainly two of those. We again went all in with changing the way we fund our institutions, but the financial aid issue has been the most intransigent of the policy vectors that were identified in that policy audit. So working behind the scenes since 2008, in 2010, overnight, Tennessee became sort of notable because we passed the Complete College Tennessee Act. And I don't think a lot of people realize we've been doing that background work, but overnight we sort of became this national focal point because we had adopted a 100% funding formula and some other very fundamental changes to academic policy having to do with increasing our degree productivity and efficiency and ultimately the educational attainment of our state, which we're near the bottom, around 44th. More recently, Governor Haslam, our current governor, has essentially built on the Complete College Tennessee Act by implementing the Drive to 55 legislation, which sets 55% as our goal for educational attainment, degrees, certificates, diplomas, or above by the year 2025. So even though we've been as aggressive and active as any state in implementing a college completion agenda, this area of finance, funding, tuition, and appropriations and financial aid has been sort of the last domino to fall in place. So there were two animating events for the paper that I'm going to talk really briefly about today. One is at the SHEEO annual meeting a couple of years ago, Secretary Duncan stood up and asked or challenged the states to come to the U.S. Department of Ed with our best ideas for how we might partner with the federal government. And he said, we're open to your ideas. And he was questioned directly. I think it was the SHEEO from Kentucky, if I recall. Bob King asked him this question, that would you be willing to look at some of the fundamental underpinnings of the Pell Grant? And to my amazement, he said yes. So I came back, reported this to the office, and in the course of things, as we were thinking about this, we convened some of our financial aid directors around the state, and we asked them, what might we do? What might be effective? And the thing that they said that was most shocking to me, I don't know, shocking, but anyway, I remembered it, was that the EFC calculation, in our view, has become a poor proxy for a student's ability to pay for college. And there's a disconnect between what they called the forgotten middle, students who were from families with an EFC in the 5,000 range or an adjusted gross income in the 60,000 or so area. They don't qualify for Pell. Not many of them require for our state merit-based scholarship, and none of them qualify for our state need-based program, which is even more stingy than the Pell Grant by a lot. And so then I went to New England not too long ago, and this was sort of confirmed there with their financial aid directors, state aid directors, that there was this disconnect, and it was around this forgotten middle. So what we set out to do, in a nutshell, was to broaden Tennessee community college students' access to the Pell Grant by leveraging an abundance of students that we have with zero EFCs, therefore leading to their receiving Pell Grant awards in excess, sometimes rather strikingly in excess, of the tuition and required fees. And so by leveraging those students in order to return some of their, what we would call an overpayment, if you'll forgive the language, it's just a shorthand, and allow us to push that Pell schedule that would be specific to Tennessee up the EFC line a little bit so we could bring more students into the Pell tent and provide them as much as 50% of the cost of tuition and fees Pell Grant, where currently they're getting nothing. So the policy change that we seek is a significant extension of Pell dollars to previously unfunded low to middle income community college students. And the mind change that we seek nationally is for states to, one, analyze their own student unit record data, clearly identify the attendance costs that they intend to cover with their state grant or federal grant programs, and to what extent they seek to cover those costs. This is going to require some tough choices, but if you're anything like the state of Tennessee, all the state money is dried up or is spoken for, and so we're seeking through community partnerships or federal partnerships ways to still make inroads, given the fact that we have very ambitious goals for educational attainment. So what we did, we looked at a fall 2010 file from our Board of Regents governing board. It's the sixth largest system of higher education, public higher education in the nation. We looked at 98,000 students from community colleges, and we found that of those students that applied for a FAFSA, that filled out a FAFSA, 75% of them qualified for Pell. Fully 50% of them, half of those Pell qualifiers, had an EFC of zero. No family resources to contribute to the cost of education. And furthermore, so in that last slide, the little yellowish area is where our Pell Grant, the Pell Grant covers students up to that EFC of its 4617 or something like that. And we're seeking to push that outward a little bit more. So If you look at the zero EFC students, they tend to be in that red area where the GPA is 3.0 or below, and the ACT scores are 20 or below. A lot of these students are collected in our community college system. That's why we decided to focus on the community colleges first. Plus, they're a little bit easier to make the case policy-wise that if you've got students who are getting nothing, by flattening the Pell schedule a little bit and extending on outward to low to middle income students, you can bring more students under the Pell tent. One thing I wanted to say is in 2011 and 12, gift aid payments to community college students totaled $233 million. Of that, 4% of that came from our state need-based grant program. For every student that we fund with the TSAA, the need-based state grant, 4 more are eligible, but they're not funded because the money runs out. And it's been that way for the last decade. 14% of that gift aid comes from the lottery scholarship, our Hope Scholarship program. And it does have a need component and a merit on top of merit component as well. But just think of the Georgia Hope in our model as similar to that. 82% of those gift aid payments come in the form of the federal Pell Grant. So in Tennessee, when you're talking about federal aid policy, you're really talking about state aid policy. Federal aid policy is state aid policy when it comes to our community college students. This slide shows that for students from the lowest EFC bands up to, say, around 60,000 of AGI, 4617 of EFC, those students, by and large, receive awards in excess of the tuition and required fees. Because there are so many of them, we would be able to reduce that over award by $50 to $100 per student and bring in a substantial number of additional students at substantial savings to those students who often are getting nothing else. As you can see, then the students who still have remaining tuition and fee need begin at that EFC of 60,000 or so, and the unmet need ranges anywhere from $800 to $1,000. By the way, I should mention that we looked at the loan borrowing from our community college students. 28% of our students borrow, and they tend to borrow about $2,000 per semester, and that's pretty much the same across all bands of EFC. It differs by institution, and I think there's some reasons. We know why that is. It has to do with the way institutions package. But so it's not like the students with the low EFCs are borrowing a lot more and the ones with the higher are borrowing a lot less. They all tend to take down about $2,000 a term. So here's the idea. I've teased you long enough with it. The idea is all we're doing is we're proposing 3 models that would make an incursion into that over-awarded students over-award and then repurpose that money so that we could extend the Pell Grant distribution on up the EFC line. If you look at and we were really creative and we called them mild, moderate, and high. And I told the guys, I said, mild, moderate, then high. That seems like one of these things is not like the others. But the only other thing we could decide on was egregious, and we decided not to say that. But currently, we pay out, we have $9 million or so in unfunded tuition and required fee need among our community college students. By incorporating one of these less or more to less incremental approaches in shifting over-awarded payments into the next few bands of EFC, we could reduce that anywhere from $7 million down to about $6.6 million. So we could reduce our unfunded tuition and fee need by up to a third, by implementing this idea. This is another look at how the program would work. As you can see, the greenish bar, the one that's farthest to the left line, that shows where we currently cut off. EFC of 5,000, nobody beyond that gets a Pell Grant currently. Our average tuition fee is about $1,600, and if you implement the mild or the moderate or the high, you're able to push that EFC band all the way out to 9,000. And, of course, to do that, you have to make a more of an incursion into the overpayment to the currently Pell receiving students. We would sort of propose settling on the moderate model where you're serving students with an $8,000 EFC and you're able to reduce their unfunded need. You're able to pay up to about half of their tuition need for the semester. This is just another way to look at the last slide. You can see you're taking the actual, the way the Pell schedule actually works now, you're amending it slightly so that you you undercut the unfunded tuition, you undercut the over-awarded tuition for the lowest EFC people slightly. You can still see they're getting an over-award in terms of tuition and fees, and you reduce the unfunded tuition of the higher EFC students. We're still not talking about high-income students, though, folks. And lastly, this is how it would look for individual students. As you can see, if you look down there around 4,000, if you look at the existing Pell model, let's look at currently EFC of 0. You've got students who now receive $2,775 a semester, and under the first model, we reduced that to $2,700. Under the median moderate model, the same, and then you only reduce their under the high model, you only reduce their award by $100, and by doing so, you're able to bring in 2,000 or 3,000 additional students with EFCs up to 8,000 or 9,000. You can see around 5,000, then you begin to incur into those people at the 5,000 EFC range who are currently getting nothing, and give them payments up to, if you look out at the high model, the most aggressive model, tuition's about $1,600 a semester, and you can see you're giving those students in the 5,000 EFC range a payment of $825. We think that's significant. I'm sure the Tennessee Promise is going to come up during our Q&A. This was all done before Tennessee Promise was a thing, but now that it is a thing, this still works. All it means is instead of shifting the cost from students more to the federal government, now we'll be shifting it from the state more to the federal government. And either way, whether we're talking about students or the state of Tennessee, we're tapped out. We need help from the federal government. And we think by looking at this, reshifting this over-award to under-award is a way that we can do this reasonably without really hurting anyone. And we've got to make a tough choice somewhere, and this is where we've decided to start. Thank you. Lashawn. Oh, sorry, that's an extra slide.
Thank you. So I want to give a little background about what MDRC is, which will give you some context for the comments that I'll make. So MDRC stands for everything, because we do everything now. It used to stand for Manpower Demonstration Training Corporation, Manpower Demonstration Research Corporation, because we did evaluations of job training programs. And we were developed to do randomized controlled trials in field settings. So for those who that sounds like jargon, that's essentially taking the methodology of a medical clinical trial and applying it to social service programs. So in the same way that you would not give any patient a medication that was untested, you would want that medication to go through a trial to show its efficacy, that it actually works at doing the thing that it's intended to do. We apply that same methodology to programs. I direct our higher education portfolio, and MDRC is 40 years old, and this is actually the newest policy area in our portfolio. And the reason is that our work had sort of bifurcated into looking at working with low-income populations from birth to 12, and then low-income populations that were hard to employ or faced disabilities. And what we realized was there was a gap in our work, which was human capital investment. And that's where higher education comes in, and more specifically, community colleges. So we went about our work in trying to understand what was needed to help community college students be academically successful. And rather than going out and developing programs from scratch, we had a series of focus groups interviews with administrators, current students, students who had dropped out, policymakers, et cetera, to hear what those concerns were. And as you can imagine, financial aid came up, as well as a few other things, such as pedagogy, curriculum, and advising. In terms of financial aid, we heard that additional resources were needed, but at the same time, other work that we had done suggested that in addition to providing more resources, providing a guidepost as to how to connect those resources to the outcomes that are desired seemed to be important. So in one of the first studies we've ever did, we worked with the state of Louisiana, who administrators there actually had the idea to take additional financial aid and tie it to academic benchmarks. So I don't want to give anyone the impression that this isn't already done. This is already done. The Pell Grant has academic performance requirements in the form of satisfactory academic progress, or SAP. Most merit aid programs will have some academic component or benchmark to it. The difference between what's currently done and what we did was that the benchmarks are more salient. So, for example, a student would be given a grant for $1,000 a semester, and that grant would be paid in 3 increments over the semester. Some small proportion based on enrollment, some small proportion based on continuing to attend or midterm grades, and then a proportion at the end once a student met a grade in a certain number of credits. So say $500 or half of that scholarship for meeting a grade of C or better in 6 credits. And so what this did was it tied the behavior that you wanted to see academically to the financial aid in a way that the Pell Grant and many other financial aid programs do not do. So for most institutions, if a student is not performing satisfactory, that student will not know that their financial aid is at risk until the end of the academic term. That's when satisfactory academic progress kicks in. So while your 18-year-old is sort of partying the first semester and living it up in the college life, may not realize that there is this satisfactory academic progress criteria, because that often is one of the things that either is not fully explained in the first term or quickly forgotten after orientation, and then becomes very real once the barrier actually hits. So I just give this background to say that we're coming at this a little bit differently in our Lumina white paper. So we've done a number of experiments at institutions of financial aid interventions, and we looked back at those studies of over 4,000 students and asked, what can we learn from these experiments about what is affordable for students? And what we learned is pretty much what's been reported in the financial aid literature, that a certain amount of money, a small amount of money, will help students, depending on the period and the economy, enroll and persist. Depending on how you structure these financial aid interventions, you can generate matriculation effects and you can generate increases in credits earned. There's a strong argument for saying that in financial aid, we should not look just at enrollment, but we should also look at increases in credits earned, because it's actually the credits earned that's going to get you to graduation, that's going to get you the credential, whereas staying in school alone will not do that. We ended up in, surprisingly, many of the same places that our other panelists ended up in terms of recommendations. So all of our papers share some commonalities. So one, we believe that financial aid needs to incentivize students. And when you think about financial aid policy, the incentives are a little bit perverse. So when you think about the satisfactory academic progress, how it's set, how it's explained, it encourages behavior that you don't necessarily want to encourage. Similarly, when you think about policy sets, such as the one that SHEEO addressed directly, the attainment of 15 credits or more in a semester, that's what we want students to do to be successful, but somehow most advisors and counselors have defaulted to the 12 credit or more, 12 credits as being full-time, because that's related to financial aid policy. But that sends the wrong incentive and the wrong message, and you will not graduate on time adhering to that policy. So we think that looking at incentives to get the behavior that you want is really important. But similarly, it's important to incentivize institutions. So as you all know, most of the funding that goes to institutions is based on enrollment. And then that leads to perverse patterns for institutions as well as students. And so if you think about, and many states are doing this, the incentive structures embedded in performance-based performance outcomes funding, you can overcome some of those perversions. All of our papers also talk about, in various ways, leveraging current aid more effectively, because we've all come to the realization that there is unlikely to be additional aid. Interestingly, when we did our study in Louisiana in the early 2000s, that was a period of surpluses. So we were able to offer additional aid using TANF surplus funds. That's no longer an option in any state. But what does exist are many institutions will have pots of scholarship funds for which they have discretion over, or scholarship providers will have a pot of funds for which they'll offer institutions, and generally speaking, these funds tend to be merit scholarships. We argue in our paper that if you're truly looking for a return on an investment, your return is actually low or zero if you're continuing to give it to that student who's going to Harvard who already has $30,000 in overpayment and excess funding. You would reach a higher return if you targeted the lower level students, not the cream, but the students who have the potential to use those funds to make a difference to attain additional education. So thinking about ways that we can work as partners, not only as a state and institution, but also bringing in our philanthropic partners to think about how to use all aid more effectively. We all agree to a various extent about the importance of assessing strategies. I always find it interesting in higher ed conversations how we talk about in the completion agenda and the failure to make real progress on students graduating. But at the same time, we don't acknowledge that what we have in place now are solutions. Everything that we're doing was a solution to some problem, and that it's working poorly is an indication that perhaps that solution either has outlived its purpose or perhaps may not have been as effective to begin with. And if we're not measuring ourselves and assessing ourselves, we can fall into the trap of creating new policies and new solutions that are equally ineffective. This is all I was saying. And then the last piece I'd say is that our work, we work with financial aid, but we also do evaluations of other programs. So we've come to the perspective that financial aid, when structured creatively, taking into account incentives, unintended consequences, being really thoughtful about the context and compromising with all of the partners involved, in the best case scenario, financial aid alone is not going to get you to move the needle to graduation. It's a more comprehensive problem than that. And the most successful program that we've evaluated to date actually takes components from financial aid, student advising, messaging, incentivizing, and pulls it together and integrates it into a whole. And that program has increased two-year graduation rates by 86%. So we think that if we're really serious about moving the needle to the point that all of the papers have made, we need to think carefully about how policies interact and how we can use the levers that are at our disposal to help students first and foremost. So the remainder of my talk is really about some of the challenges that all of the ideas that we've presented will face in terms of implementation. One of the benefits of sitting where I sit and doing what I do is that we work directly with institutions, with administrators, financial aid directors, to recruit students into these programs. So we're down sort of in the ditches, understanding what it takes to actually get a policy implemented and implemented well with fidelity. And that gives us some lessons about things that we may want to be aware of as we talk about policy changes and things that colleges are going to take. So the first challenge to implementation of a program from our experience is execution. You can have the most beautifully designed program, and you all know this, and then it gets into the field and someone abuses it. It does not look at all like what it was supposed to be. Interestingly, I learned this very early in my career at MDRC. I've been there about 14 years. I was hired to be I'm an economist by training, let me preface that. I was hired to do statistical analyses and design programs. And I designed the most elegant and beautiful, statistically appropriate programs. And my colleagues who actually worked in the field during one of my performance reviews said, Lashawn really needs to get out. She really needs to get in the field, to sort of see how things are. And my predecessor never went in the field. So I went out and I talked to a counselor who, on paper, had 20 years of experience. He was supposed to help low-income students work through their issues in order to be academically successful. In the program we were evaluating, there was a required mandatory meeting with a counselor. So on paper, he looked perfect. In the room, talking to him, he proceeded to talk about those people, the students, having babies, etc. I'm an African-American woman. The population we're talking about, 80% African-American. I had my daughter at 20. And so I'm sitting there thinking, this guy is going to ruin my impacts. He's taken my program and he's screwed it. And then that's when I realized that you have to design for reality and not for what works on paper. Because if your execution is poor, it doesn't matter how perfect your design is, the ultimate outcome of that will be failure. So it was very important for me to get out, and I've not made that mistake since. The other important thing to consider in implementation, and Katie and Brian both said this, is complexity. The keep it simple, sweetie principle is really important. One of the things that we learned in doing some implementation of our program, I mentioned this performance program we did, it was very similar to how Pell operates, except that the criteria checks were earlier in the semester, but somehow students were able to remember what was required for our program, but could not tell you what was required for Pell or their other financial aid. And what we learned from the focus groups was that the criteria were very simple to understand and to remember and salient. And so as we think about policy for institutions and students, the keep it simple, sweetie, is really important. Incentive design is complex. Every time you design an incentive, you encourage people to respond to that incentive. And I am of the opinion that when something negative happens in terms of an incentive, that's not necessarily a negative outcome. That's what was incentivized to happen. So if you pay for seat time, you will get a lot of enrollment and little success. That's what you've paid for. So you've gotten exactly what you've incentivized. And so it's very important as we think about developing incentives that we spend equal, if not more time, thinking about the unintended consequences. Another important thing here is the context, because the context can change the incentive structure. To Katie's point about managing partners, don't let perfection be the enemy of the good. This is a lesson I've learned as well. While something can be optimal without constraints, we're operating under so many constraints that in economics, what we really have is a constraint optimization problem. And the more constraints you have, the less optimal you're going to get. And understanding that from the beginning can help us develop policy that's good and improves upon what we have. And to that point, I'll jump to the assessment. I think this is really important to remember around financial aid, too. So historically, we've done a lot of research in financial aid, and we know how the needle moves and to what magnitude. So it's generally, I think, important to build those expectations into your policies. So if you know that that the most that your needle is going to move is about 7 percentage points, that you take that into account when you do your cost-benefit analysis as to whether it's worthwhile changing in this very complex way. I would argue that Hawaii is really smart in the case study that SHEEO does, and that they essentially affected their financial aid policy by a public campaign that was a little over $110K, that essentially said, full-time is 15 credits, and let that be the message that's permeated throughout the advising, throughout all of the advertising, et cetera. And they did nothing to change any policy. So in thinking about ways to implement change, we also consider some of the behavioral things and some of the things that are lower cost when we think about the policy implications of cost. So I'll end with this one thing. Our challenge in scaling up things and changing financial aid policy and improving outcomes for students is not just a challenge that we face. It's a challenge that all organizations face in thinking about scale up. I find it particularly useful when I'm thinking about scale up and how to affect large-scale change to think about this slide on what effectiveness is. And this is an equation that was actually shared by the president of the World Bank, because their challenge is how do you eradicate disease in third world countries? How do you do that at scale? It's a similar analogy to what we're trying to do. How do you engender completion? And what's really important about this is it gives all of the ingredients to me that's needed to make policy effective, which is what we're aiming to do. First is efficacy, knowing whether the thing you have works. That's actually better done in health because there are a lot of randomized controlled trials. There's a lot of causal evidence about what works. We don't have as much in policy, but I think that's where policymakers and researchers can come together and partner, because if researchers understand the type of evidence that you need and the types of studies that could be done, over time we can build a repository that you'll be able to pull upon to help inform decisions. Coverage, are we getting the target population for which things were developed? That's questionable. Sometimes we're focused on low-income students, and those are not the students that are necessarily getting the aid. So when you look at the merit programs, those are not necessarily targeting the students that we say in other programs in other areas are our focus. Diagnostic accuracy is whether you can actually get the target population you're trying to get. User compliance, this is referring to whether students are doing what they are supposed to do. So this is also related to the incentive structure. And then provider compliance is what we've been talking about as in terms of institutions as well. Are the other players doing what they're supposed to do? If you have breakdown in any one of these things, you're not going to have effective policy. So as you think about effective policy, you really need to be thinking about all of these components in conjunction. And with that, I'll stop since we're over.